Hey everyone, this is Vipav Kotek here for CG Tuts Plus, and today I'm going to be going over the multipass rendering process in Cinema 4D. Now, this tutorial is going to be broken down into 3 videos, and in each video I'm going to be going over some topics that are listed over here. So for this first video, our first topic is the difference between single pass and multipass. Well, you can think of a single pass render out of any 3D program as footage that comes out of a camera. It has information that's the RGB information for a particular pixel, and that's it. So it has RGB information and nothing else. That one file or all the other files, all they have is RGB information. Multipass, on the other hand, has the RGB information, and that RGB information can be broken down and separated into different elements. So you can have the shadows as a different layer, and have the diffuse as a different layer, and the specular as a different layer. But in single pass, it's just one flat image. So you can also have tracking data from a null or an object transported as tracking data into any compositing program. In a multipass, you can have solids, and those solids can be used to replace. They can be replaced and changed with pictures or movies, so that you can have new textures and whatnot. And the lights can be separated. So if you have 3 lights in a room, the first light can be separated, the second light can be separated, and the third light can be separated. And it's all those lights, different channels can be separated. So that's another thing. And the last thing, I believe, is you can have lumamats exported for your object, so that you don't have to track anything. Mask anything in any compositing program. So the reasons you should use multipass is because you don't have to track anything, you don't have to mask anything, and it gives you more flexibility over how you want to composite, and if you want to add any additional elements to it, because you can also export 3D data, as we'll discuss later. So those are the differences and reasons why you should multipass. Use a multipass rendering process instead of a single pass, because I know I've used single pass rendering processes in renders before, and they haven't turned out all that great. So now let's go ahead and take a look at how you can actually set up a multipass renderer in Cinema 4D. So let's jump into Cinema, and the first thing you need to do is go to your render settings, and you're gonna have to check the checkbox for multipass. That's gonna be at none, and then saving we'll take a look at later. All right. And then you have to go to multipass and add all. So now you've just added all the different layers that can be added to a multipass. So you're basically telling Cinema that, okay, for example, if there's any shadows, separate out the shadows from everything else. So the shadows are just a different layer. If there's any reflections, then you can then you're telling Cinema to separate those from everything else. So that's what you're basically telling it to do. But the problem with this, adding all of them, is you do have a lot, alright? So you probably want to get rid of some of them. To do that, to figure out which ones you need and which ones you don't need, you should go to save. Make sure it's not saving at all. You should go to output and make sure it's current frame, and also that the width and the height are pretty small so that it doesn't take a long time to render. And then you should render in picture viewer. So as soon as it's done, I'll be right back. Alright, the rendering is done, and you're probably going to be on history, but you can go to layer, and then you're probably going to be on image, and then you can switch to multipass, and it's gonna make sure that you're in the right position to check what you need to. Alright, so you have all these different layers rendered out, and this is your final product, but these individual elements are shown right here. I think I can make them bigger. Maybe not. Nope. Either way, you can. I think it's good enough. These small thumbnails are enough to tell if they have anything or not. So to figure out which ones you need and which ones you don't, all you have to do is click the eyeballs and turn them on and off a couple times. See if there's any difference in the image when they're turned off and when they're turned on. And as you can see, in atmosphere and atmosphere multiply, there's no difference. You can also tell by looking at the thumbnail, because it's all black, that it's not going to have anything in there, at least for this frame. You have to make sure that you check this for every frame. No, you don't. If you know that you have some kind of atmosphere in your scene, then you probably want to make sure that you separate that channel out. But if you know for a fact that you don't, then you can just leave it out. If you just have a single frame that you want to export, then this is a good way to find out which ones you need and which ones you don't. So for this frame at least, you can see that there's no atmosphere and there's no atmosphere multiply, so I can take those out. There are refractions and reflections, so probably want to keep those. There's no ambient occlusion included in this one, nor global illumination, caustics, or ambient, so I can delete those. I can delete, well, I can't delete shadow. I mean, shadows are usually a pretty important part of your render, you know? Usually. So I probably want to keep that. I have specular, and it's a pretty big difference, you can see. I have diffuse, and that is also a pretty big thing, so probably want to keep that. Illumination is also pretty big, so I mean, I've never really used illumination. I don't know what it would be used for. You can keep it if you want. I don't think I'm going to keep it though, really, because it doesn't have much to do with what I need. And from motion vector to material color, really I never have even thought about using these. I don't even know where you would be able to use them, except for maybe material color, because really I really can't think of any place I would use them. So I'm gonna delete those, and then have an RGBA image, which is just a regular image, and I have a depth pass, and I won't be needing that in this render. So now I can go to my render settings, and we said I'm going to keep the background image, so that's a RGBA, that's a single pass image inside of a multipass render. I don't need ambient, so I can delete that. I do need diffuse, specular, shadow, reflection, refraction, so I'll keep those. Ambient, occlusion, GI, caustics, atmospheres, I really don't need. As I said, post effects has nothing, so I can delete that. As I said, material, color, up to motion vector, I'll delete because I really don't know where I would use them. And illumination and depth, I said I won't use either. So now I'm left with these 6 layers that are going to be exported and rendered out from Cinema as different files. So let me just go ahead and show you real quick how Cinema handles rendering a multipass. Alright, so you basically have all these. I used Photoshop as my format, and what it did is it said, well, it took, for example, ambient occlusion. I had ambient occlusion set for the first one, so I said ambient occlusion should be separated from everything else if there's any ambient occlusion inside of my render. And what it did was it has a separate file for ambient occlusion and has a separate file for each and every single ambient occlusion involved. And then it went on to shadow, and there's a different shadow for each and every different frame. So that's it gets the file number of files gets pretty big. And if I show the properties, it's 1.68 gigs. So that's pretty big. You know, that's why you want to delete everything that you don't need, because it does take up a lot of space on the hard drive, and it can also get very messy if you use the ones that you really don't need. So that's the first reason why you should just delete everything that you don't need. Of course, you don't delete stuff that you need, otherwise you won't get what you want. Alright, that's so after you've deleted what you don't need, you can go ahead and render it out. Make sure you have the output set to manual or all, and then you'd be good to go. It would render out. You can bring them into a compositing program and then do what you want with it. That's just the most basic multipass rendering there is. There's a lot more to a multipass render. The first thing I think I should point out that, of course, you need to have the save checked in order to make sure that it saves. Just enter in a file and then choose a location and you'd be good to go. I think the first thing I should point out is you have a whole bunch of formats that you can choose to export your multipass in. You have the basic movie files, and then you have pretty much Photoshop, JPEG, PNG, and TIFF. I use Photoshop simply because, well, it's an image format. It's not a movie format, and I don't know. It's Photoshop. I think is better than JPEG. I kind of like and I can go in and edit just one if I want to. So you should use any kind of image format, and the reason for that is how Cinema handles rendering, so, and saving it also. So if you choose a movie file as a format and you say render, so it's gonna render every frame. It's gonna render every frame, and then it's gonna save the file. So it's gonna be like rendering, and then saving. With Photoshop, however, you have what Cinema does is it renders every frame. So it renders the first frame, saves it, renders the second frame, saves it, renders the third frame, saves it. So it's making more than one file. So for each frame it's a file, while for a movie, for each render it's one file, right? So the advantage in that is if it shuts down, if your machine shuts down, or if the render is stopped for any reason at all, if you're making a movie file, then it's going to be corrupted. The movie file is going to be made, but it's going to be corrupted, and you won't be able to use it, and you'll have to start the rendering process all over again. If you use Photoshop, though, you can take a look at what frame you were left at, because remember, it saves after every frame. It doesn't save just at the end. After every frame it saves. So you can take a look at the last frame that was saved completely and then start it from the next frame. Start the rendering process from the next frame. So that's why it's really helpful to use Photoshop as the file format, or any image file format is good. Also, the fact that it gives you more options in depth. So you can see that I have 8, 16, and 32 bits per channel depth options for Photoshop. If I go to QuickTime, I only have 8, so that's probably a good reason why you should use. Like, I think JPEG you only have 8. PNG you should have more. Yes, you have 8 and 16. But Photoshop, you have 8, 16, and 32. So that's probably the best thing to do. Right, what's next on our list? Done that. We have 3D data and the separate lights function. Let's take a look at the separate lights function. Or, you know what? Separate lights. I think let's just take a look at the compositing project file and 3D data. So when you save, what you can do is add 3D data and a compositing project file to the scene. So, or to the export. So the compositing project file, what it is it takes a target application, and Cinema takes a target application and saves a file for that particular application to use. And inside of that file, the information contained is basically, if you have After Effects, what Cinema is going to do is it's going to make an .aec file, and inside, if you import that .aec file into After Effects, then it's going to have a comp in there ready for you. And if you double click on that comp to open it, then it's going to have the shadows, the reflections, the refractions, the diffuse, the speculars, all in their correct order. And the shadows are going to be multiplied, the specular is going to be screened or added, and it's going to be set up for you right there, and you don't have to import each and every single element by itself and use it like that. So it's very useful to save the compositing project file and make sure you're using the right target application. And another option in that compositing project file is you can include 3D data, make it relative, and including 3D data is basically like exporting cameras and lights. So if you want to add a 2D element to your scene, but you've already rendered out the movie, and now it's a 2D file, right? And you want to add a 2D element to the file, but you want it to interact as if it was in 3D. That's when you would include the 3D data and make it relative, and that's going to export the camera and the lights with their values, their color values, and the camera with its lens values and all that good stuff. And it's going to make it really easy to simulate a 3D environment inside of After Effects while keeping the background footage 2D. So if that makes any sense, I do hope it does, because it's really helpful to have that option checked. We'll be going over that later too, so don't worry. And then we have the separate lights function. So if I open up my picture viewer, bring it down over here, and let's render it out again. Cancel. I want to make sure that I don't save at all, because I've already rendered out this file. So what I'll do is render it out now without saving it, and now you can see that I have refraction, reflection, shadows, speculars, and diffusers, two different layers, and then I have my overall, just a background. Yeah, that's just a backup copy, a single pass instead of a multipass. So now I have 5 different layers instead of 20 different layers, and it's much easier to figure out which ones are which, and it'll be much easier to import 5 5 layers into After Effects rather than 20, you know? That's why it's much easier. Now you can see that I have all my diffuse. So let's take a look at my scene first. Let me minimize these. What I have is 3 lights and a camera. Well, I have the 3 lights, but inside of my picture viewer, you can see that I have just one diffuse. So let me make this bigger again. I have just one diffuse. So I have all the base colors. If I just show the diffuse, all the base colors for all the lights are put into one channel, just diffuse. And then I have the speculars, and all the speculars for all the lights are just put into one channel or one layer. And then I have the shadows, and all the shadows cast by every light are just in one layer. Same with reflection and refraction, but you know that's based upon an object. It's not based upon light. So what if I wanted to turn one of the lights off, but I didn't want to turn off the other light's shadows? So what if I wanted to like get rid of the yellow one, but keep the other ones? I wouldn't be able to do that if all the shadow, speculars, and diffuse were in just one layer. And that's where the separate lights function comes in, and it's a really nice function. So I have the separate lights right here. If I click on Multipass, I can choose all or selected. I usually just use all. And then you have 3 options for the mode, 1, 2, and 3. The first one channel, diffuse plus specular plus shadow, is going to separate each light out, but it's just going to make one layer for each light. So what if I wanted to blur the shadows for one or darken them without touching the diffuse or the specular? I wouldn't be able to do that if I had just one channel. If I have 2 channels, then I can choose a diffuse and specular, and then I have shadow as a different one. This is probably the most so-called realistic, because if you think about it, if you have a red light and the intensity of that red light is really low, then you're not going to have a specular. It's going to cast a diffuse of really low red light. But the specular is also going to be like really dim, and it's going to be red as well. It's not going to be blue, and the specular is not going to be really bright. That's why 2 channels is probably the best thing to use. But you also have the option of 3 channels. And if you want to make like a magical world where if the light is dim, then the specular is really bright, and it's the opposite on the color wheel. So if it's red, it's like blue or green or something. You can use 3 channels, and you can change the color of the diffuse and intensity of the diffuse independently with the specular, and the shadows are of course just a different layer. There's also a shadow correction option, and should be probably kept on because it's a correction. Just, never tried to play with that, but just a thing. Now, you might have noticed that our ambient occlusion, so if I bring up the picture viewer, and let's go to history, let's go to this one, layer. For this one, the ambient occlusion didn't have anything. But what if you wanted ambient occlusion? Well, just adding that obviously didn't make a difference. So what do you have to do? You have to understand that right now you're basically telling, or first let's forget about the ambient occlusion first. I want to show you something else. So after I completely forgot about that. After you've separated out the lights, let me just render it out again. I'll be right back. Alright, so now that it's rendered out, you can see that it's been separated out into 3. Oh, I forgot to change that. That's alright, I can change it later. I meant to make it 2, but you have the shadows on a different layer, the specular on a different layer, and the diffuse on a different layer for each and every light. You might also notice that there's nothing on the shadow layer, nothing on the specular layer, and nothing on the diffuse layer. The reason for that is Cinema thinks that, well, you've already got the shadows, and they've already been separated out from everything else, and they've even been separated out from themselves according to the light source. So you really don't need all the shadows together and all the shadows separated out from everything else according to the light source in just one render. So and the same thing with specular and diffuse. So there's nothing in shadows, nothing in specular, and nothing in diffuse. And for that reason, I can go into my render settings, take the diffuse, specular, and shadow, and just delete them. And now I'm left with 3 files. Of course, well, 3 layers in the so-called multipass render. I have even more in the light 1 and light 2, but after you've separated out the lights, you can go ahead and delete the shadow, specular, and diffuse, and that way you don't waste extra space on your hard drive. So, something to keep in mind. And right now I'm just going to go ahead and change that back to 2. There we go. So now about ambient occlusion. What you have to understand is when you add in, say, ambient occlusion right here, you're saying to Cinema that if there is any ambient occlusion in the scene, then it has to render it out on a separate layer. But you're not actually telling Cinema to add ambient occlusion to the scene. You have to go to Effect and choose ambient occlusion right there to add it to the scene, and then to separate it out from everything else. So that's something you should make sure you do. Alright, so ambient occlusion and ambient occlusion in both spaces. That's the only way you can get ambient occlusion. And the same with global illumination and caustics and anything else that's in effect, you know? Alright, and then after you've done that, I think you can render it out and you'll be good to go. So let's render out one more frame. For this one, I'll be looking for ambient occlusion if it works. Let's go back to history. And I believe it's this one. So this one we didn't have the effect added, but the ambient occlusion was a layer. So there's nothing in ambient occlusion because of that reason. Now if I go to one that's rendering right now, if I go to layer, multipass, you can see that there is in fact some it's really slight. You can see it over here. There's some but really slight ambient occlusion going on. It gives your images some great realism. So something you can add to your render and make sure it renders out properly. Alright? So basically, make sure that you check out each and every frame. Make sure you have only the ones that you need. Make sure you're saving a compositing project file. Make sure you're using an image file format. And also that if you want to separate out the lights, make sure you do that because that's a really good feature that Cinema has. And I believe that concludes our first video. In the next video, I'll be going over some of the more advanced features of multipass rendering and exporting. So be sure to check that video out, and I'll see you there.